Welcome to the Healthy Gut Podcast with Rebecca Coombs, the place where you can learn how to achieve a happy, healthy gut. Here's what's coming up on today's show. Hey guys, before we start today's podcast, I want to share some of the exciting news with you about my forthcoming trip to the US to launch my US editions of my cookbooks. Now, as you may well know, I am going to be touring around the country doing multiple events. If you would like to know more about the events that I will be involved in, you can head to my website, thehealthygut.co/events. And there you will see the listing of my events as they become available. Now, I am very busily locking them all in, but I can share with you the dates that I will be in each city. So, LA, I'm going to be with you on the 19th and 20th of June. San Francisco, I'm with you on the 21st and 22nd of June. Portland, I'm with you for a whole weekend, and we have some amazing things organised with 8 Hearts Medical Centre, and I'll be there from the 23rd of June, leaving on the morning of the 27th of June. Seattle, I'm coming to you, and I'll be there on the 27th until the 30th of June. And Phoenix, I'm also going to be with you for quite a long time. I'm there for nearly a week, which is really exciting. So I'm going to be there from the 11th till the 16th of July. Now, I am locking in dates and venues in some other cities, so do stay tuned in the coming weeks as they become available. In Portland, we have some really great events coming out. We're looking at cooking demonstrations, live podcast recordings, SIBO workshops, and more with 8 Hearts Medical Centre. If you would like to attend one of these events or any of the other events in the other cities, head to thehealthygut.co/events and make sure that you submit your details, because it will be first in, first served. We won't have unlimited capacity for these events, so I do hope that I get to see as many of you as I can. And do list the order of preference of which events you would prefer to come to the most out of all of them, so I can make sure that we hopefully can get a ticket for you. And if you know anybody who would be interested in joining forces with me to put on an event in your local city, or have me as a guest speaker come and speak to you in your local city, do let me know. Simply drop me an email at rebecca@thehealthygut.co. Now, the other exciting news is all around my US editions of my cookbooks. The digital cookbooks are currently available, and they're emailed to you immediately upon purchase, so that means you can get them via email. But the printed cookbooks are now available to pre-order, which is super exciting. It does mean you will get an edition straight off the press, so to speak, when they become available from the printers, and they should be dispatched in the next couple of weeks. So if you would like more information on either the e-cookbooks or the printed cookbooks, and you are based in the US or Canada, then head to SIBOcookbooks.com and you will find more information there and how you can order a copy for yourself. Here's today's episode. Welcome to episode 32 of the Healthy Gut Podcast, and today I'm joined by Dr. Anthony Hobson, who is an internationally renowned British consultant clinical scientist with experience across the NHS and private healthcare sectors, as well as in academia and the pharmaceutical industry. He has a broad base of experience in assessing gut function from top to bottom, covering areas such as gastroesophageal reflux disease, irritable bowel syndrome, incontinence and constipation. He has been recognised as advancing the field of GI physiology by winning several prestigious awards, and has published over 200 journal articles, abstracts and book chapters, including 2 first author publications in gastroenterology. A frequent speaker at conferences around the globe about advances in GI physiology, Dr. Hobson also provides lectures to train UK doctors to help them understand more about the applications of GI physiology testing. Today we talk about why gut function is so important and why we should be looking at the entire GI tract rather than just one section of it. We also talk about transit times and how we can test our own transit time. And also looking at bowel retraining and long-term implications for people with IBS and SIBO. And we talk about why the UK is behind in its awareness of SIBO and other GI issues, and what people can do who are based in the UK or perhaps anywhere else in the world who are experiencing difficulties finding a practitioner that knows much about GI issues or SIBO and what you can do about it. I hope you enjoy today's episode with Dr. Anthony Hobson. Welcome to the Healthy Gut Podcast, Dr. Anthony Hobson. It's so wonderful to have you on the show, and I finally have a doctor from the UK appearing on the Healthy Gut Podcast, so I'm really excited about that. So thanks for coming on.
Thanks for inviting me.
My pleasure. I'd love to talk about how you ended up being a gastrophysiologist with an interest in the whole gastrointestinal system, and tell us how you got to where you are today.
By accident, mainly. My two loves when I was at school were sports and science, and I really would have liked to have been a footballer or maybe a golfer. But when it became apparent that that wasn't going to happen at the ages of about 18 or 19, then I wanted to look at something that really stretched me in terms of science. And there was a scheme at the time, a training scheme, which meant that you worked in hospitals for 3 days of the week with patients, and whilst then attending university and doing academic work. And the physiology pathway was respiratory, cardiology, and strangely enough, gastrointestinal. And I think I was probably the first student to go through the gastrointestinal pathway. And that was back in 1991. And the thing that appealed to me was that the hospital I worked at said that they would support me not only for the first 4 years, which we needed to qualify, but beyond that, to go on to do a master's and PhD and work in academic institutions, publish papers. And that was a really appealing set of qualifications for me to get. So it was a bit by accident, but we fell into it and we had some great support up in Manchester, and Professor David Thompson, who was one of the world leading neurogastroenterologists at the time, was incredibly supportive. So that's how I got into it.
Wonderful. And it's lucky for the world that you did. You were recently, or somewhat recently, out in the States speaking at the Cedars-Sinai SIBO event, and I know that unfortunately I wasn't able to attend. I would have loved to have been there, but there was definitely a lot of interest in what you were saying, and I hope that you enjoyed being out there as well.
Well, for that actual event, I was speaking to them from where I am now today in the UK, but I followed that event up and went to spend some time at Cedars-Sinai and just talk through some of the issues that were discussed during that day, just so I felt comfortable and up to date with what was happening in the US. There's a big effort in the US to develop a consensus around SIBO, and I want to try and spread that message in the UK. So it was fantastic to spend a day with Mark Pimentel and Ali Rizai. And we spent a couple of days talking about our own research that we've just finished in the UK. So that was a really good opportunity to be out there, and I hope to go again soon.
Yeah, definitely. One of the things that I know firsthand from my own experience of living in the UK for 7 years was the fact that experiencing digestive discomfort, and now that I know it was SIBO that I was experiencing, it just wasn't even on the radar. Even getting the classification of irritable bowel syndrome wasn't even really talked about. And I was there for the majority of the 2000s, 2001 to 2008. It was really difficult to get any kind of support around gut gut health and gut function. I hope that it has improved from when I was there. But what's your take on how things are going in the UK in terms of medical support for people suffering from gastrointestinal disorders and distress?
It's a bit of a perfect storm, to be honest, in that gastroenterologists in the UK at present don't actually have functional bowel disorders as part of their training. So they get trained in nutrition and endoscopy and inflammatory bowel disease, but there's no formal module about IBS or other functional symptoms. So anything they pick up is usually if they work in a hospital that has a special interest in it, or if they have a special interest and seek it out. So even though 40 to 50% of the patients that they see will have these disorders, it's amazing that there isn't any formal training. But we are trying to change that. So I sit on the neurogastro committee representing GI physiologists for the BSG. And recently we held an event. It was a kind of a trial event in the Midlands to get trainee gastroenterologists to focus more on functional disorders, how to diagnose them, how to treat them. And it was incredibly successful. So there's about 25 young trainee doctors, and the feedback was amazing from them. Why haven't we had this before? So we are making some progress now at a kind of national level to try and improve that training pathway and offer those courses. And we're going to take that training program around the UK so that more people can experience it and hopefully officially slot it into the BSG, which is the British Society of Gastroenterology training program. So we're starting from quite a low level, which is amazing to me, but we are putting things in place to try and improve that.
I'm so excited to hear that, and that will just benefit so many people so that, when they do go to their doctors or their gastroenterologists, that they're hopefully in the future getting some answers as to what's going wrong. Can you just give a description around what is a functional disorder of the GI tract?
So most doctors will want to rule out something structural or inflammatory. So if there's going to be something like a diverticulitis or pseudo-obstruction or inflammatory bowel disease, that's what they'll test with endoscopy and stool tests and so forth. And when all of that comes back normal, then the diagnosis is a functional one. And what does that mean? I mean, functional has a bad press, but for us, we think a functional diagnosis is a positive step to the pathway to good treatment. So the analogy I always use is that the car looks nice, but it's not driving very well. And therefore, you have to do complementary tests that measure how the gut is functioning, as opposed to just looking for inflammatory events that can be treated. So that requires the use of new technologies to look at digestive function, to look at motility, to look at pH profiles. And that is complementary to what you can see with tests like endoscopy.
And I think that it's great seeing the tests and the science that's evolving in order for us to really explore more around the function of the gut. There's something that I was reading on your website, which is around understanding gut function and the importance of looking at the entire GI tract rather than perhaps just one element of it. Can you sort of further elaborate on why we should be looking at the entire GI tract?
Well, the gut's not very good at telling you what's wrong. The symptoms that you get from the gut are quite vague. So, bloating can be caused by issues in the stomach. It could be due to the SIBO. It could be due to constipation and colonic issues. The way people tell you about their symptoms is not always a good pointer in the right direction for a diagnosis. So, if somebody turns up to us with heartburn and regurgitation, which responds to antacid therapy and no other symptoms, then you're pretty certain that they've got reflux. And just by measuring the reflux and looking at their esophageal function is probably enough. But more and more people come to us and say, well, we have reflux, but we also have bloating, we have altered bowel habit, we have all these different things going on. So at that point, you need to build up a little portfolio of tests that answer all the questions. If you take reflux disease, for example, Lots of these people have been on proton pump inhibitors for a long time. That affects how the bacterial load in the gut and can lead to things like SIBO. And they're going to surgeons to have anti-reflux surgery to correct their hiatus hernia or get them off PPIs and resolve their esophagitis. But after surgery, they still have all their digestive symptoms that are below this. The surgery is not a magic bullet. It will only fix the reflux. So what we try and do is classify patient symptoms sort of top to bottom pre-surgery. And then that helps to manage the expectations of patients, saying, we can have this treatment for the reflux, but everything else lower than that will need to be treated in a separate way. And that helps to, especially after surgery, to make sure that they don't go back to the surgeon. They may go to the dietitian or gastroenterologist and have the digestive issues sorted out separately. So it's that kind of approach to look at things holistically and manage everyone's expectations and then target treatment to the different aspects of the patient's abnormalities.
What are some of the ways in which you can assess the function of the gut from top to bottom?
The technology is truly amazing now. So everything that we thought was going on, we can now see in great detail. So things like high-resolution esophageal manometry with a combined impedance recording allows you not only to look at the muscle function and swallowing function of the esophagus, but also looks at the functional consequences of that. So you can see the swallowed material going down. It's like a virtual barium swallow. You can see whether patients are regurgitating in patterns of things like rumination syndrome. And it's very important when you're doing these tests that you can give this visual feedback to patients, especially if there are behavioral issues, so you can help them to come up with mechanisms to stop that happening, or even just explaining the physiology of what's happening with their symptoms, showing them that the acid reflux is coming up, how high it's coming up, how it correlates with what they're feeling is really powerful. And things that we can now do in the lower bowel. So, for instance, with techniques such as Smart Pill, giving us insights into things that we thought were going on but were very, very difficult to study in the past. So all of that is now becoming very achievable for us.
One of the things I realised when I went through my own experience with SIBO was how little I knew about the digestive tract. I obviously knew that, there was a mouth and an esophagus, the food travelled down in a stomach. I knew that there was an intestinal system, but I didn't really know much about it. And it was only because of SIBO that I started to educate myself about this actually very amazing, incredible system that most of us, I think, just are completely unaware of. Do you find that do your patients come in with minimal awareness around what the digestive system does and that they're able to learn more about it? Or are they already coming in very educated and that these technologies are able to then just give them an extra level of awareness?
We definitely get people at all points of the spectrum. So we get people who have absolutely no idea what's going on and are kind of extremely worried because every time they eat something, they feel like they've been poisoned. And the more healthy food they eat, the worse they feel. And they just don't understand this relationship between what's going on in their digestive tract, what they're eating and what they're feeling. So they're starting at a point of kind of virtually zero knowledge. And then we get patients who have looked up things on the internet, who've read the papers, who've read the books, and come in very well informed. Of course, the problem with that is that some of the stuff that you can read and pick up is not actually true. So it can be quite challenging to debunk the myths. And of course, we don't have all the answers. We have to be very careful that anything that we talk to patients about, anything that we do regarding testing is based on the best practice and what is proven. And we're constantly updating our methods and the way we do things to make sure that we are applying what is universally, or at least the consensus is the right thing to do. And we're very open to add things and to take things away when those things are either proven or debunked. So it's a bit of a partnership, really. We're there to try and help educate patients, and also we're the clinicians that send patients to us. So when we do our reports, for instance, we try and be as helpful as we can to answering the questions that are most important to patients, and also to try and guide doctors into, if they're not fully aware of what the results mean, to try and help support them and educate them as well. So it's a real team effort between us all to try and move this field forward, because there are certain things that are well accepted and there are things that are in development, and I think we have to all move in that direction.
I know that for many of my listeners, and I fell into this category myself, that once I became aware of my condition, I went obsessively onto the internet to research everything I could about SIBO and my gut and all the rest. And one of the things I realised was there was a lot of half-truths or misinformation and half-truths out there, blogs written by people that had kind of taken an element of something and perhaps interpreted it themselves. What are some of the myths that your patients might read or see on the internet that it drives you crazy, that you'd love to debunk?
So it's hard enough to get a consensus about SIBO. And for me, looking at it from a physiology point of view, it makes perfect sense that some people will have gastroenteritis or be on proton pump inhibitors and have bacteria in their small bowel that interferes with their digestion. So the gut bacteria start to break things down before they have a chance to digest it. That makes sense to me. I can understand how that works. But even that is a lot of gastroenterologists struggle to see that that's a condition. And I think that's because the methods of testing have been seen as unreliable, and the methods of treatment are not easy. But the things that drive me a little bit mad, because it's very hard to prove them, and I am taking steps to try and alleviate this. The three things that people will come to see me about will be leaky gut, low stomach acid, and candida. And these things tend to take hold, and they may well be true. Gut permeability may be changed in some people, and people may be producing less stomach acid, and some people may have candida, but it's very hard to test those things. So that's the thing that makes it difficult for me, because I don't yet have the tools at my disposal to test those things objectively. But we are working on things looking at gut permeability. The smart pill test allows us to look at acidification of a meal, which is a kind of surrogate for what used to be done with things like the Heidelberg test, and obviously working on new tests to look at things like candida. So those things are the bits that make it very difficult for me, is if I don't have the tools to actually prove that these things are going on in patients or not. So it's a three-strand approach, is trying to work with the conventional tools that we've got and prove that they work to the clinicians, and then look at other things that are important to patients and try and develop those tools.
And there's definitely a lot out there on the internet around leaky gut and low stomach acid. It's interesting seeing the ebbs and flows of interest on topics, and the very large SIBO Facebook group at the moment. I just seem to be noticing a lot of posts from people around, I think my stomach acid is low and that's why I've got SIBO. Yeah. So it's interesting that you raise this as one of your things. You're like,
Yeah, it kind of makes sense to a lot of people. But so there was a paper that came out a couple of years ago which looked at giving a nutritional drink and smart pill, and then looking at how quickly that meal is acidified as a function of stomach acid output. And so we've looked at this paper and we've looked at these things ourselves, and we definitely see a proportion of patients in whom the period where the gastric pH is high after you've eaten a meal is different to normal subjects, and this should be a function of stomach acid output. So we're quite keen now to push that forward and do some validation work around it, because it could be a method of a reason why people get SIBO, because they're not producing enough stomach acid. But I'm a scientist, so I want to be able to prove that. So we're making some progress on that area, and likewise with gut permeability and leaky gut. We're working with a company down in the south of England at the moment that have a test for this. And if we can put together a research program where we can look at the relationships between these things, then that will help us to have the confidence that this is actually a phenomenon. But in a lot of patients, the reason that people feel they've got a leaky gut is actually because the gut's a bit hypersensitive. And the gut is very good at protecting itself. So, unless you've got some over-inflammation down there, the chances of increased gut permeability are quite slim.
A test that I did when I was actually after I had completed my SIBO treatment and I had got my all clear result was my naturopath suggested that we test for gut permeability, and something that we did, which I'm interested to hear your thoughts on, was I drank a liquid solution that then measured the particles that came out through my urine, which I collected over a 12 or 24-hour period, I can't remember now exactly, and sent it off for analysis. And based on the size of the particles found in my urine, that then was to determine how permeable my gut lining was. Is that test something that, is that even done in the UK? And what are your thoughts on that test?
It's a test that was done, it is done in the UK, and there's a very eminent gastroenterologist, Robin Spiller, who did a lot of work in this in the 90s. So I think it is a valid test to do, because obviously the different size particles tell you what's passing through the gut lining, going into the bloodstream and then being excreted. So I think it is a valid test to do, but I don't think there are enough sort of big scale clinical trials that have been done to look at the relationship between that gut permeability and things like SIBO and other symptoms. And that's the kind of thing that we will be looking to do over the next couple of years.
And I think there's so many studies and a lot of research that it will be so welcome when it's done to either prove or disprove some of these theories, and just having some more science around it, I think, can only be beneficial. We've talked a little bit about the SMART pill, and I'd really love for you to share with the listeners around what it is, in case anyone listening has never heard of it before, and how it works.
So this is quite an old technology. Back in the even in sort of the 60s and 70s, people were swallowing these capsules on the ends of pieces of string. And basically the capsule measures three things. It measures temperature, and that just tells us when it's in the body and out of the body. So that's kind of a safety measure. It measures pH, so it looks at the acidity profiles throughout the gut. And it measures pressure, so you can look at contractions and different patterns of contractions. And it was my colleague Mark Scott who had done some of the validation work when they were developing this new version of the capsule that brought this to my attention. And previously, if you wanted to look at these things, it would take many, many hours. You would have to do some radiological exams. You would have tubes in, and it would be really unpleasant to get all this information. Where with the Smart Pill, what you do is you eat a test meal, which in most cases is a cereal bar full of all sorts of nasty sugars and things like that. And then you swallow the capsule. And then that gives you some information about, as I said before, how the stomach acidifies a meal, so how it behaves when it's got food in it. And then as the food gets liquefied and empties into the small bowel, then you start to get the stomach's natural contractions, so the cleaning contractions called migrating motor complexes, and they start to come into play. So it tells us something about fasting activity. And it's only when those big contractions come that the capsule can be pushed out of the stomach into the small bowel. And then it traverses through the small bowel, and the small bowel has the highest pH in the body. So by the time it reaches the distal small bowel, then the pH is usually about 7.5 to 8. And then the really interesting thing for me, which has been the focus of my research recently, is what happens when it pops into the proximal colon, so into the cecum. So the cecum is this kind of second stomach where all our undigested material goes, and bacteria ferment all this undigested material, and we get some nutritional benefit from that. It keeps the gut healthy. When it becomes excessive, that's when you get all of these symptoms of bloating, distension, loose bowel motions, and we've really not been able to look at that before. And my research recently has really shown that this is a problem in patients with bloating, distension, loose bowel motions, SIBO. And our recent clinical trial, which is just being analysed at the moment, has reinforced how important that is. And then once this proximal colon issue has resolved, then the capsule moves through the colon and tells us whether the transport through the colon is normal as well. So that can pick up things like slow transit constipation, for example. So it's a really simple test. As long as you can swallow the capsule, which is quite big, it's like a big vitamin capsule. Once you've swallowed it, you clip on a little recording box and you go out of the unit and have your normal activities. So it's quite a physiological test in that people are in their own environments. And most people pass it within 1 to 2 days, but I think the record for us was 9 days of a lady who was just trying to prove the point that she was really constipated. So the capsule can last for up to 16 days, but after about 3 or 4 days, we usually get people to take a gentle laxative if they've not passed it naturally. So it's been a really useful tool for us, and we've published quite a few papers on it. And our recent clinical trial, we've just had a couple of abstracts accepted, both for the Digestive Diseases Week in America and in the BSG in the UK. So we're making progress with that.
It's so interesting, and it just makes me think of when, I was a child and seeing all this kind of science fiction stuff. And now it's a reality, which is wonderful. So is this going to be the new way of testing for the migrating motor complex?
Well, there are pros and cons to Smart Pill. Because it's not a fixed point, then it basically is a bit like a surfboard. In the stomach, it picks up the migrating motor complexes really quite nicely because it's trapped within the stomach at that point. But if you, say, for instance, have a catheter in the small bowel, you can look at the patterns of migrating motor complexes in much more detail. So that would still be the gold standard. If you thought that somebody had disordered small bowel motility, then putting a tube in, having it fixed, looking at a section of the small bowel and looking at the frequency of migrating motor complexes would be the preferred method, albeit a little bit unpleasant. But what you can certainly do is to see these patterns of contractions, whether there are more contractions or less in patients. So when you eat something, for example, you should get a different pattern of contractility, so we can pick that up. And again, we're just finishing a really big study in about 200 healthy subjects looking at these patterns of contractility so we can compare with our abnormal database. So there are limitations to what Smart Pill can do, but I like to think that we are validating the things that we can do with it to an extent where we'll be able to look at different patterns of contractions. So, if people have too few contractions or too many contractions, how that correlates with symptoms. All of that data we're trying to extract from our database at the moment.
And I found it very interesting listening to you talk about the area of the large intestine that acts like a second stomach, and that can often be a problem area for people that are experiencing a lot of gas. And it was also, I think you said, diarrhea.
Yeah, so my first part of my career was been looking at upper gut function and looking at how the stomach works and how reflux comes up into the esophagus and how it's cleared and how things empty from the stomach. And I've never really given any consideration to the cecum. It's just this kind of slightly dilated part of the colon. It's got an appendix just wobbling at the bottom of it. And I don't think anybody really, because it's quite hard to get to, I don't think many people had given it much thought. But if you think about what happens, say, for instance, with people with lactose malabsorption, the lactose should be cut in half by the enzyme lactase and get absorbed in the small bowel. But if you don't produce enough lactase, then this sugar gets into the proximal colon, where there's huge numbers of bacteria. And if you can imagine, I always think of this idea of like a demijohn of wine brewing in the corner. You have this body temperature bag of liquid with sugar and bacteria in it, bubbling away inside you, producing who knows what kinds of chemicals and other things inside. And the bowel is going to get upset from that in many cases. And that's why it comes to this point where if it can't absorb any of those sugars or break them down sufficiently, then people will have diarrhea and loose bowel motions. And it will be the same with fructose malabsorption. for example, and these things will be affected by things like SIBO, which increase or speed up small bowel transit. So things you would normally digest end up in the proximal colon. So I remember speaking to a colonic hydrotherapist who they often have really nice insights into patients, and they described this kind of fluid that came out as a witch's brew, like a cauldron of kind of loose bowel motion that's going on inside it. And it's really not surprising that people feel really quite unpleasant when they eat these things, because you will be absorbing some of these products of fermentation, and you've got a rich vagal innervation of the proximal colon, which will be making you feel fatigued and nauseous. So it's really become a focus of my research now to try and understand more what is going on in that region and how we can modify these processes to improve symptoms in patients. And that's what our last clinical trial was all about.
I can just visualize this kind of, as you said, this body temperature area of it's just, particularly if you haven't been able to break down lactose and it's the bacteria fermenting, and they're having a wonderful time eating all of these sugars that are coming through, and you can just visualize this kind of bubbling pot.
And what trying to use my upper GI knowledge for lower GI reasons, this is where we came up with this idea of reflux of colonic contents going into the distal small bowel, being another cause of bacterial overgrowth. And what seems to happen is that if you put short-chain fatty acids, which are the byproduct of fermentation, into the colon, it slows down colon transit because the body's trying to absorb these things. But when it gets to a certain point, they can't absorb anymore. That's when you start to increase the osmotic load in the colon, and that's when you trigger the loose bowel motions. So I'm trying to think of what's happening down there as reflux disease for the lower GI tract. And once I have that model in my mind, then it gives me methods of what we can measure, but also how we can try and improve clearance. So what can you do to reduce this fermentation and reflux? How can you improve the clearance from the small bowel into the colon and onwards? And that's the kind of model that we're working on at the moment is, can we do this with diet? Do you need to have treatment of the SIBO first before anything works? But that's the kind of concept that I've got in my own mind, that there is a pattern of SIBO which is similar to what happens in reflux disease in the upper GI tract.
Something you've talked about in a presentation, which I, when I was doing research for this interview, I found online. It's amazing what you can find online. And you talked about anal vomiting. Is that part of this process? You're talking about the reflux going back up into the small bowel, but what does anal vomiting mean? No, this is a great term.
We're coming up with things like cecal belching and cecoparesis, and it's just trying to help people understand that this process is a bit like what happens in the upper gut. So in the upper gut, if the stomach doesn't empty, that's gastroparesis. And at a certain point, then people will vomit and regurgitate. And this is particularly common in diabetics. And for me, diarrhea is what you get when you get gastroenteritis, or if you have bile acid malabsorption. So you get this watery, undigested food coming out. And when people have these loose bowel motions associated with bloating and distension, it tends to be, and I don't want to be too graphic here, but more like a hot, frothy stool that is more akin to this second stomach saying, I can't handle this anymore, I'm going to get rid of it, and ejecting it in a style similar to vomiting in the upper GI tract, as opposed to diarrhea, which, for those people who've been away to Thailand or Cambodia or somewhere and had just pure water coming out of the anal canal, then I think it's just different. So I was just trying to get across this idea that the two processes are different. This idea of diarrhea predominant IBS, I don't think in a lot of cases that it is diarrhea as we know it. It will be in some. I think it's just to try and differentiate the two processes. So it's a little bit of fun on my part, but it does raise a few eyebrows.
I think it's really a great way to think about what is actually happening, and I think that's been a very great explanation. A question I've got for you just around the cecum, given that the appendix comes off of it, what's your theory around the role of the appendix, and also what happens to those of us, myself included, that have had appendicitis and ended up with our appendix removed. And I don't know if there's ever been a study done around the correlation between people with appendicitis and appendectomies and SIBO. But I know just through discussions with people, so many people that have SIBO that I have spoken to, and obviously it's a very small sample size in the whole scheme of the world, but that they've had issues with appendix and now have SIBO. Do you have any thoughts on correlation with the two?
Well, if I take a step back, we did a really cool study a few years ago. One of my surgical friends noted that the appendix is very much looks like a piece of, if you excuse the expression, rat colon. So a lot of the basic research that's been done is based on animal research, and we always wanted to move towards human models. But if you look at the appendix, it has its own, obviously, blood supply, nerve supply, and it gets taken out quite a lot. And what we managed to do at the Royal London with Charlie Knowles was to show that we could, in these appendix that have been taken out, that you could keep them and measure nerve function and look at all sorts of different things using this tissue. And it kind of brought it home that even though it seems to be a redundant organ, it still has all of the things in it that would make it function as a normal part of the bowel. So it's there, obviously, for a reason. Otherwise, we would have got rid of it from an evolutionary standpoint. But what it does in relation to SIBO is uncertain. There are people who think it's a kind of repository of normal gut flora, and that after you have had antibiotics or an infection or whatever, that the bacteria that remain in the appendix then repopulate the bowel and go from there. But I'm not certain that's been proven. So I'm not really doing a very good job of answering your question. I think much more needs to be done. But I think there is quite a lot of move now to think of non-surgical ways to treat appendicitis rather than just whipping it out at the first sign of trouble. And I saw an article about that the other day. So I think my kind of long-winded answer is that it's there for a reason. It may be beneficial to have it, but obviously you don't want it to burst and cause peritonitis and life-threatening conditions. So I think much more work needs to be done to try and understand its role.
I agree. And it's interesting. I also read that theory that it was a place for excess or bacteria to be housed, and that it would repopulate the bacteria if it was depleted. And I can understand that. And I did wonder myself, I thought, gosh, I wonder if that's perhaps what's happened to me. My appendix, I was told I had a grumbling appendix, and it had flared up and off, on and off over the years from when I was quite a young kid. I remember having some pretty gruff doctors putting their fingers up my bottom to try and feel around for my appendix and thinking, oh my gosh, this is pretty unpleasant, until finally my appendix had enough and it decided it needed to come out. And unfortunately for me, my symptoms were atypical, and so they didn't immediately operate. And by the time that they got me onto the operating table, it was rupturing, and I was pretty unwell for quite some time. I had been travelling for work and was stuck away from home, and my poor mum had to fly up and look after me. But one of the things that I believe that operation left me with, despite saving my life because I would have been in a very poorly state if it had stayed in, was they'd cut me open pretty quickly because they realised things weren't going so well. And I am pretty certain I've got some adhesions in my gut area because I've had that operation, and I've had a couple of other operations for endometriosis. And so you then think about, well, we're saving a life, but what else? What are we leaving the person with that perhaps might provide future complications? Yeah,
and there's a great talk by Peter Payne on our website from our IBS Roadshow that talks about the harm that surgery does, and particularly in IBS patients that have prolonged issues, who are probably quite rightly convinced that there is an issue that can be resolved with surgery because they are quite desperate. That surgery, very rarely helps in these disorders, and more often than not makes things worse. And I would encourage your listeners to watch Peter's talk on the website because it's really, really very sensible. And he's just presented an update on that recently to our trainees, showing that really is the case. So, I mean, if you're desperate and you think there must be some kind of blockage or some issue, then, having surgery is usually not the issue if all the imaging studies have shown that there aren't any structural abnormalities. So that would be a very strong warning, is that if a functional diagnosis has been made, then don't go and see a surgeon.
And I think something that I wish my younger self had known, and I know now, but when I was diagnosed with endometriosis and I had reasonably bad endo, I was told that I would be on the once a year circuit for surgery. And I had 3 surgeries, I think it was, for my endometriosis before coming across a wonderful physician actually in London who was a much more holistic approach to her patients, and we started looking at the function of my gut, food intolerances and all the rest, and I haven't had an operation since. But what was never talked to me, and I've talked about this with other endo patients, was that at no point did anyone say, okay, so we're going to go in and laser you for your endo, but the risk is that we may cause some adhesions, which may be problematic for you in the future. So I agree with you wholeheartedly that I think that we need to tread with caution before opening ourselves up. And what I am really interested in is that since healing my gut and getting my gut into a much better state, my endometriosis is virtually non-existent. So I haven't had to have another surgery, which is wonderful for that.
Yeah, and that's what we do as physiologists. I mean, going back to gastroesophageal reflux, there's a proportion of patients who describe reflux symptoms that actually are due to SIBO. And I've convinced many of the people who refer to us now that if we check for SIBO as well as for reflux, then there's a proportion of patients that if you treat the gut issue, then their reflux symptoms go away and they don't need surgery. And, surgeons are sensible chaps most of the time, and ladies, and they don't want to have patients where they have bad outcomes. So by, using the tests that we have to really define what's going on in patients pre-operatively, quite often you can prevent unnecessary surgery, but also point people in the right direction who will benefit from it. So I think that's why it's a real team effort in what we do.
Let's talk about testing. What are the testing practices that are generally used in the UK to test for SIBO?
Now, this causes quite a lot of contention. There are lots of people who don't believe in SIBO. There's an issue around getting the right treatment for SIBO, and we're up against it. But fortunately, the US guys have published a consensus document talking about how to try and standardize the testing and interpretation of SIBO. And that's one of the reasons I went out to the Cedars-Sinai, just to go through that so I could come back and discuss it with my colleagues in the UK. So many people think breath testing is quite unreliable, and it's not certain whether this is due to the way people do it or actually it's just a natural variation in the way things move through the gut. So glucose has been used to look for SIBO because glucose is quite sensitive. If it picks up bacteria in the proximal duodenum and it's positive, then it's a strongly positive test. But of course, the SIBO may be further down the small bowel, and therefore you will get a false negative in many patients because the issue isn't in the first few feet of duodenum. So we always tend to use lactulose, and lactulose is non-digestible. So wherever it meets bacteria in the bowel, then the bacteria will start to break it down, produce gases, and this comes out through your breath, and we can pick that up. So the contention around that is, well, how do you know where the lactulose is? So when you start to see a rise in gas, is that due to bacteria in the small bowel, or is it in the colon? And I think, like all of these things, you have to be a little bit pragmatic. We tend to be quite conservative in how we measure SIBO. So we look for a rise of gas levels of about 10 parts per million within about 60 minutes of ingesting the substrate. And then we try and correlate that with symptoms. So not only do we see it as a physiological test, we see it as a provocation test. So if you can give somebody a couple of teaspoons of sugar and produce most of their symptoms and pick up a physiological change, we think that's pretty good in terms of a positive test. And then, of course, you can treat and then retest and see how symptoms improve. So that is probably the easiest way that we can look at SIBO. You can actually put a camera down into the small bowel and take aspirates and then measure how much bacteria are in that region. But obviously, this is very invasive. It's difficult to get down to the distal small bowel, and there are some problems with collection. So I don't really think that is always an answer unless you are having real problems in treating the SIBO and you need to identify exactly what kind of bacterial organism is in there. So at the moment, for SIBO testing, we recommend using lactulose. We agree with the methods used in the US. We think that their cutoff points for positivity are a little bit bold in that they look at 20 parts per million within 90 minutes. And I think for a lot of those patients, the lactulose might be in the colon. But as they stated in the US, this is a starting point and then allows us all to collect data in the same way so we can make comparisons across groups and then develop the model further as time goes on.
And what about the IBS check test, which is very interesting, I think, to be looking at the what's happening in the blood with people that have been exposed to food poisoning?
Well, I was very fortunate that just as we were putting our final ethics submission in for this trial in 50 IBS patients, I became aware of IBS check. So I quickly wrote it into the protocol, and we've been able to look at in quite great detail how the IBS check works. So we've got data back from about 50 IBS patients. About 25% of them were positive for the antibodies in IBS check. And what this is picking up is those people that have had an infectious event. So they've had an episode of gastroenteritis. And this has set up a level of autoimmunity and set up some antibody production in those people that seem to have some effects on motility. So the antibodies tend to interfere with ICC cells, which control motility in the distal small bowel. And I think the theory, and this is an evolving theory, is that it almost changes the small bowel to make you more likely to get future gastroenteritis events. So it puts you in a profile that's more beneficial to the bacteria that you would normally clear. And again, some of this is anecdotal now, coming from my visit to the States, that the antivinculin, in particular antibodies, the higher they are, then the worse the gut motility seems to be. And that you need more intensive treatment to try and get those antibody levels down to get the gut motility back to normal. And certainly from our experience post-trial, that those patients that had a positive IBS check have seemed to be responded more poorly to antibiotic treatment and have had to have either different courses or add on something like a prokinetic that helps the clearance through the small bowel. So it's an evolving area. It's only important in a proportion of IBS patients, but it does give an organic cause to the ongoing symptoms, and it may be a guide to have more intensive treatment or more investigation to try and understand what's happening in the bowel. So I think it is going to be an important tool in our armoury going forward.
I had an email from a woman in the UK not that long ago who was at her wit's end. She had been to her doctor who had said, "I do not believe in SIBO, it does not exist." What's your advice to anyone listening who might be in that state where they're being told this condition that you're telling me about is not real and go away? What's your advice for them?
Get another doctor. I mean, it is contentious, and I think this is like I said before, a bit of a perfect storm in that there's a lack of education. There's a few negative studies out there that question the methodology to examine SIBO. The treatments aren't readily available. Doctors don't really want to put people on a rotating course of broad spectrum antibiotics to treat this because of all the other problems that might occur. But you've only got to look at the data from the big target trials with rifaximin in the States to show that it does work in a proportion of patients. So I think that the methodology to identify SIBO and the correlation between a positive diagnosis and a positive outcome of treatment needs to be documented further. One of the slightly disappointing things about the target trial was that the breath test data was not used to predict the outcome of the treatment. And I think that would have given a bit more confidence around the two. And I think that's something that we're going to try and address going forward. But, if I take, there's a really nice young chap on our clinical trial who he'd been away, he'd got gastroenteritis, he'd come back and he had terrible symptoms. And we tested him twice. We did smart pill on him as part of the trial. He had a negative IBS check, but he had a positive SIBO check. And he managed to convince his GP to give him a course of rifaximin. And I saw him a few months later and he just shook my hand in the street and said, "It's a miracle, I can eat what I want again." And that's the kind of happy story that you want in patients. And you can do post-treatment breath tests to prove that the SIBO has gone or not. So it's about building confidence and getting the right treatment. What we're setting up in London and in Manchester is a kind of joined up pathway where we have what I'll call friendly gastroenterologists who believe in the problem. We have the state-of-the-art testing so we can provide objectivity for that. We work closely with dietitians so that post-treatment we can implement dietary strategies to try and retain remission of the SIBO. And it's up to us now to provide that outcome data over a period of time that will help the conventional medical community buy into this. And I think the last piece for the UK is to try and convince the drug company that make rifaximin to make it a little bit more accessible in the UK and do the trials to get it registered as it's done in the States. I mean, anecdotally, one of the gastroenterologists I saw in America said that since rifaximin's been brought into primary care, then referrals for IBS to secondary care in his practice have gone down by about 60%. And you can imagine what a massive cost saving that would be to the NHS. So I think there's a real need to push this forward on many levels, and we're doing our best to provide the infrastructure to do that.
Can you quickly talk about the types of treatment options that are available in the UK for SIBO?
Okay, so the pathway that we work with anyone coming into the clinic, the advice that we give is, first of all, direct them towards self-help strategies. So things that are available from the IBS network and things like the low FODMAP app on the Monash University. First, a lot of people will be able to manage their IBS type symptoms themselves. The next step that's recommended in the NICE guidelines is to go and see a dietitian and try and do a directed dietary intervention to try and reduce your symptoms to a level where you won't need further treatment. But what we've found, and studies in the States have shown, that if you have SIBO, then none of the diets work. You have to treat it. And in the private sector, then it's a little bit more easy for people to get their heads around paying for a prescription for something like rifaximin, which is obviously the best treatment out there because of the mechanism of how the drug works, that it only really works within the small bowel. It shouldn't affect any of the colonic microflora. It's not systemically absorbed. So that's where we would go next. Unfortunately, if you are in the NHS, then your GP is unlikely to want to give you a £300 treatment. And that's where the problem, I think, occurs. We can make a firm diagnosis, but then which antibiotic can be used? So some people use Augmentin or doxycycline or metronidazole, and it becomes a little bit more hit and miss around that treatment. We have had some contact with some nutritionists who've used the antimicrobial herbal supplements with some success in some people, but these are still antibiotics as such, so you could still get potential resistance to these substances. So the treatment at present is one of the major concerns. If you can't get access to rifaximin, what do you do? And if you've exhausted all your dietary plans, the elemental diet has been used, but again, I don't think that really treats SIBO very well. I think it reduces the colonic profile more than it would do the SIBO. So I think that's the bit where we need to really work on going forward, is to try and rationalise the treatment pathway to make it more convincing for doctors in general practice.
And one of my questions to myself that I often wonder about SIBO is, and particularly when we've talked about the function of the gut from top to bottom, if one of the reasons, or if the primary reason for a person developing SIBO is that the motility of the gut has slowed right down and it has allowed this backwash of bacteria to come up, could it then be reversed if the motility is improved and you're not doing anything to reduce those numbers through, say, taking rifaximin or herbal antibiotics? And I don't know if you know the answer to that or if there is an answer to that, but I often think, could we just be reversing it if we just got our motility working better again?
Yeah, I totally agree. And one of the reasons we used linaclotide, which is a kind of colonic prokinetic, or at least it induces more bowel movements to clear things, in our trial was to see that. We don't think we were powered sufficiently to get the answer for that, and SIBO did complicate things. But certainly the consensus in the States is that if you can, first of all, do two things. One is to give yourself the best chance of your migrating motor complexes to work. So that is to have a meal and then wait for several hours before eating again. If you snack all the time, then you're never going to get your natural clearance mechanisms working. So to leave longer periods between your meals to allow your bowel to go into its fasting rhythm and clear things through more accurately. Second thing would be to reduce these highly fermentable or hard to digest foods, so you put less stress on the proximal colon, so you're less likely to get reflux through. And then you can add on a prokinetic such as prucalopride, which works through the serotonin system to gently help clear things through the bowel more efficiently. So all of those things should help to contribute and help your body's natural clearance mechanisms to help clear the SIBO.
Yeah, that's great. I've often thought that. And I know that particularly those people that have been around, they've been dealing with SIBO for a long time, and the antibiotic or herbal treatments aren't seemingly being overly effective. I think that they often get to that point where they think, well, what else is there? What else should I be doing? Because these treatments aren't really working. My numbers aren't really dropping down. What would you do with a patient if they were in that state where the treatment doesn't seem to be working?
That's a difficult question. These are patients that usually need maybe more detailed investigation to see if there's a structural reason why their SIBO is persisting. To see if there's any obstruction or sort of diverticular or some other reason why it's persisting. Like with any condition, you're not always going to get a 100% cure rate for it, and it's just managing through things like diet and medicines to try and reduce the symptoms to a point where they become manageable. So there's never going to be an absolute perfect cure for everybody. But I think the understanding that we're developing now of how to reduce symptoms and maybe to eat foods that reduce the attractiveness of the bacteria to colonize the small bowel and things like that, and things that you've discussed in your books and your website that can help to sort of maintain a level of symptoms that are manageable for patients is the only option we have at the moment.
And my final thing that I'd like to talk about, because I think it's quite important, is non-cardiac chest pain and its correlation with gut health. And I know myself, I have experienced a lot of chest pain in the past. This is all pre-SIBO diagnosis, and I used to think, oh my gosh, I'm having a heart attack. Or my grandfather had heart disease and had three bypasses, had 3 heart attacks. He was, we grew up with a very strong awareness around cardiac issues. And so when you have these very strong chest pains, it's quite natural, I think, to think, something's wrong with my heart. But now that my gut is in a much better state, I just don't get that pain. Can you talk about what that is and why it can be correlated to the gut?
So this is the first half of my academic career. So my PhD was on non-cardiac chest pain and developing new tools to investigate the mechanisms of it. So if we start with acid reflux, then we developed a model where we put acid into the esophagus and showed that even small amounts of acid can sensitize the nerves in the esophagus for up to 5 or 6 hours. And if you repeat the acid infusion, then you get a bigger sensitization effect. So certainly in a proportion of patients, acid reflux is to blame. Acid is really, stomach acid is really pernicious stuff. And if you continually bathe the esophagus in it, it will make it too sensitive. And because the esophagus shares many of the same nerves as the heart, then pain is often referred to structures similar to where you would get heart pain. And we've blown balloons up in ourselves and done brain imaging studies to show all of this, and actually felt those sensations and that kind of panicky sensation that you get when you get pain in your esophagus. So the treatments for that are potentially antacid therapy, and we showed that you could reverse the sensitization by reducing the amount of acid exposure. So that's kind of one cause for it. But there are a proportion of patients where actually the sensitizing stimulus may come from different parts of the bowel. So one of the experiments we did was to put capsaicin, which is the pungent ingredient of chili, into the small bowel, and then measure pain thresholds in the esophagus, and showed that by sensitizing one region of the bowel, you could actually cause increased pain sensitivity in the esophagus, which was away from the sensitizing stimulus. And that's because the way the spinal nerves from the gut go into the spinal cord, they spread out, they fan out, and injury to one part of the gut can make another part of the gut sensitive. So there's another mechanism. And you can use kind of gut-specific painkillers to try and reduce that sensitivity. None of them are perfect, but certainly things like tricyclic antidepressants used at very low doses, or SRNIs can be used over short term to try and reduce gut sensitivity in those regions. And the final cause of non-cardiac chest pain would be abnormalities in gut motility. So have you got an obstruction in the esophagus that's causing restriction to flow, or are you getting spasm in that region? And patients who take opioid medication, for example, often get discoordinated esophageal contractions and spasm. So it could be a motility problem as well. So there were the three main areas: acid reflux, gut sensitivity, and motility issues that can cause non-cardiac chest pain.
Can you tell me what kind of pain is common, or the type of pain that people might feel if they've got this non-cardiac gut pain? Oh, chest pain, sorry.
Yeah, so the pain itself kind of escalates. So it might start off as a kind of dull ache or a kind of burning sensation in the chest. But as it becomes more severe, the esophagus doesn't have many nerves of its own, so it starts to borrow nerves from surrounding regions. And this is the referred pain aspect. So it starts to spread across the chest. It can go into the back, it can go into the shoulders, up into the jaw. And the more intense and more prolonged it becomes, then the more structures it refers to. So the skin can become sensitive. And it really is a very worrying pain. Having had it done experimentally to me, it's a kind of inescapable pain that then also activates the autonomic nervous system. So you begin to go pale, you might sweat, and really feel quite unwell. And it's very similar to what you would feel with a heart attack, but obviously without the serious consequences of a heart attack. And that's why most patients will go for an ECG just to be reassured, and that's what you should do to make sure there isn't a cardiac reason for it. And then once that's been excluded, then there are tests that you can do, such as esophageal manometry, reflux testing, to try and find out the underlying cause of it.
I used to have pain that would spread across my back. It felt like my shoulder blades were, made of hot pokers, and there would be other types of pain that I would often feel where it felt like something was constricting my lungs and my heart, and if only I could breathe out far enough, it would pop it, but it was excruciating to do it, and I'd end up doing these very short, shallow breaths, which does not help you to remain calm at all, and the many times that I'd have pain searing up into my jaw, or down my arm, which, you're told if it's pain coming down your arm, then that could be very much a heart attack. But all of that has stopped since clearing up my SIBO. And I did do what you said that many patients do, is I've gone and had an ECG done. I've even worn a monitor for 24 hours because I was adamant that there was something wrong with my heart, and it came back perfect. So my little heart's fine. It was just all this other pain that was being caused, I'm sure, by my intestinal system.
Yeah. and it's a bit like appendicitis. It starts off on the wrong side because that's where the appendix develops from a kind of embryological point of view. You only really feel it where your appendix is when the pain is referred to the skin above it. So the gut it's a strange sort of organism within us, and it basically has to give you a non-specific alarm signal when something is wrong, to change your behavior, to stop you eating, to help you rest. Because you can't escape from the pain, like you can move your hand away from a hot object. So the gut is trying to tell you that something's wrong, and it uses this non-specific alarm system, which it can be quite frightening.
It can be, and that's a really great description of it. Dr. Anthony Hobson, it's been so wonderful having you on the Healthy Gut podcast today. If people would like to connect with you, what's the best place for them to reach out and connect with you?
So we've got a website, which is thefunctionalgutclinic.com, and there's contact numbers and request forms and things like that on the website to get in touch with us. That would be the easiest way to do it. And what we tend to do is then help people, point them in the right direction of a good gastroenterologist or colorectal surgeon or whoever is the most appropriate. And then we work as a team with those doctors to try and find out exactly what's wrong and how we can help them. So that would be the best way to get in touch with us.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sparing your time to come onto the Healthy Gut podcast today.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you for asking.
I hope you enjoyed episode 32 with Dr. Anthony Hobson. If you would like to get the show notes or any of the links mentioned in today's episode, head to thehealthygut.co/functional health, and that's all one word. If you would like to keep up to date with my US tour events, make sure you head to thehealthygut.co/events, and I'll be updating that page every single week as details of my events become finalised. So make sure you keep checking that page to see whether I will be coming to your city. And if you would like to grab a copy of the US edition of the cookbooks, head to SIBOcookbooks.com. And for anyone living in the US or Canada, you can also get a printed edition of the US cookbooks sent to you locally, which means you'll only be paying local postage, which is super exciting. So those books are now available to pre-order, and you can get your hands on a copy straight off the press. So head to SIBOcookbooks.com to order a copy. I love hearing your feedback, so make sure you leave a rating and review in iTunes. And if you have found this episode to be helpful, don't forget to share it with your friends. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, Pinterest, and Google+. Just look for us under The Healthy Gut. Coming up on next week's show, we're joined by Alyssa Tate, and we're talking all about visceral mobilization and adhesions. It's a topic that is very interesting to me, as I believe that I am full of adhesions. So I hope you find that interesting too on next week's show of the Healthy Gut podcast. You've been listening to the Healthy Gut podcast with your host, Rebecca Coombs. To learn more about the Healthy Gut or our podcast, head to thehealthygut.co/podcast. And as we are fully funding this podcast, if you would like to help support the continuation of this podcast so that we can continue to bring you future episodes, all you need to do is make a contribution at thehealthygut.co/podcast. We would like to thank Belinda Coombs for the production, editing, and original music score of this podcast. To hear more of Belinda's music, head to soundcloud.com/Belinda Coombs. The Healthy Gut podcast is a production of The Healthy Gut. Thanks for listening.